I think I can talk mostly about the experience as being an academic, so being a member of staff in university. And I think universities have got some way to go because, as I say, my experience, particularly at Leeds and Lancaster and Strathclyde, is that there is a genuine interest to make the institution accessible, but that's very difficult to see in reality. And to give you some idea of what I mean is that when I came out as being dyslexic 3 years ago professionally, I'd kept it a secret all my life. Only people very close to me would know. Many people approach me, colleagues and from different universities, saying, "Thank you for disclosing this, Nigel. I've got dyslexia, but I've no intention of telling anyone because I think it would limit my career." Professional people contact me and say, "It's great, I'm a lawyer, but I think the charge out rates of my firm would be reduced if my clients thought I was dyslexic." So even though there is a genuine institutional response that recognizes the Equality Act, and I think people do operate in good faith of that, the reality is somewhat different because people are fearful that by disclosing, and maybe dyslexia and other neuro, I'm going to use the word disability for now, is challenging in a place like a university because it's full of words, it's full of clever people. So if you're not neurotypical, are you by default in the wrong place? I don't believe I am, but I can understand why colleagues might feel vulnerable by disclosing it. So I think that's probably my answer to that one, Anna.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Okay, next we've got Jason, if you'd like to present your answer.
Hi, yeah, so I just want to give a background of some experiences I've had in academia. It might end up sounding just like a list of grievances, but the point I'm trying to make is that the way these things build up over time, and each individual act seems like it might be a small thing, but compounded and together they become a big deal. So first off, the first PhD program that I got into, I could not attend, and I also was offered the most money at this school and a more prestigious school, but the department offices weren't wheelchair accessible. And I was actually going there to study disability studies in a theater department. At the school that I did attend, I was reprimanded for being late several times to the classes that I taught because the campus shuttles, either the list didn't work or the drivers didn't know how to operate them. Before I got my PhD, I went to law school, got a law degree, and the school was in a beautiful new fancy building that was got awards for environmentally friendly architecture, like green architecture. But the year before I attended, it was actually sued by a fairly prominent alum, also a wheelchair user, because the new classrooms were not wheelchair accessible. I also was invited to one of the more prestigious schools in the United States to accept an award for diversity and inclusion work and be inducted into a graduate student honor society. But when I got there, I couldn't get on stage because the lift was broken. And the dinner the next night did not have any accessible bathrooms. So I ended up leaving. And if you go to their website, I'm actually not in any of the pictures. I was excluded from all of the pictures of the event after my, calling this to their attention. And so then I also have had friends who we've put on performances about accessibility and have had deaf and hard of hearing friends unable to attend because the school didn't provide budget for sign language interpreter. I've also presented papers at academic conferences where I couldn't get on stage. And lastly, the biggest thing I want to bring up is that I have missed faculty meetings, and I'm supposed to be a project advisor for a senior thesis project a couple years ago, and the lift in the building was broken. So I tried to make a good impression as a junior faculty member, but had to file a complaint with human resources. because I couldn't do my job. So my point is that disabled people, we end up working much harder than able-bodied people to achieve like really the same goal. But not because we're less intelligent or less efficient, but because the built environment around us itself has to be dealt with before we can even think about doing our job or our schoolwork. And so, yeah, we as disabled people steadfastly push through these issues, but it's one barrier before all of the other work that we have to get to.
Thank you very much, Jason. Nia, do you believe academia today is accessible?
So I guess my answer to this is a bit twofold. I think, on the surface, you could say yes, because the universities, they technically have these systems in place. They've got the disability services and they give you like maybe an adjustment plan like my uni does, where they try and make these accommodations. But I think actually inherently, no, it's not. Because a lot of the time, like even if you just look at the profile of students within university, there's a severe lack of disabled students and we're so underrepresented. And when we are present, the accommodations they're willing to make for us often don't align with our legitimate needs. And I think, there's kind of almost, this front of we're giving you the support, we've got this and we'll do this for you. But actually, when you try and utilize those services, there's also a lot of hurdles in the way, I've found. And so there's this lack of flexibility where maybe you can't get an assignment done on time, or you need a little bit more support with this, but actually to accomplish that you've got all of these hoops that you need to jump through. And that's something that can be challenging enough, but especially if you're like potentially if you've got like a flare-up of something, or you've got this additional problem that you're having to kind of fight against some of the time to even accomplish just like the basic things, to then have these additional hoops, it just kind of feels like it defeats the object, I think, a lot of the time. And I think also I think it kind of reflects on our education system in general as just being not as necessarily as accessible as would be ideal, because I think that kind of links into this idea of how underrepresented disabled students can be within university settings. And there's a reason, I would say, that people maybe don't get this far so often, or those of us that do have really had to battle to some extent to be able to make it. And then when you get here, it's just a lot of the time a further battle. And I think one thing that the pandemic has really highlighted for me is the amount of accommodations that lots of universities have not been willing to make for a number of years, that they've suddenly kind of realised, oh, actually, we do have the resources to make these accommodations, and we'll do it now because it's a pandemic and everyone needs it, not just because there was a subset of students who we could have been helping to try and get them onto a level playing field with some of our other students in terms of their access previously. And so I'd say even now, like with the pandemic again, obviously massive impact on everyone, all students. I'm also a student rep on my course, so I'm hearing a lot of people's views about how challenging this year is. But I'm also hearing a lot of disabled students' views, and the thing that's really not being considered is that actually things can be harder anyway, and this pandemic is really, really kind of bringing that up a notch and making things even harder than normal, where it is for everyone, but for us that can be a whole other group of things. And so I guess whether or not academia is accessible, for me, surface wise, yes. Inherently, no, it's not.
Thank you so much, Nia. I definitely relate to a lot of what you're saying there. Lily, do you believe academia today is accessible?
I'm going to say no to that question. And what I'd specifically like to speak about is, I think it's linked to the privatisation of unis, is that when you get to university, so when I arrived in first year, I was armed with my learning disability assessment that I'd gotten in school that says what my disability is. And the university said to me that I would have to get the higher education assessment. And I said, okay, fine, I'll get that, assuming they'd pay for it, much like my school did. But because it's a private institution, they wouldn't pay for it. And it costed £400 at the time. I think it's now 520. That is not the kind of money that I had. And I was also not willing to find that money kind of on a principle basis. But so what I had to do instead is that I've just always picked modules that don't have exams in them, which in a subject like international relations you can do and get away with, but if you're doing something that's a STEM subject, it's a lot harder to do that. But myself, and I have a lot of friends who couldn't afford to get that assessment, so have never had any of the disability arrangements throughout university. And then so like the only thing that I got is, so when I hand in an essay, I have this kind of like cover letter that says this student has a disability that might affect their spelling and grammar, and that's, everyone gets that letter if they have any kind of learning disability. And I think that also represents a lack of nuanced understanding, because yes, my spelling and grammar is affected when I'm writing, but there's like no consideration of how hard lectures and seminars are for me. If I'm tired sitting in a lecture, I won't be able to hear, and things like that. Like, it's not just about, I find spelling really hard and I find grammar really hard. There are so many more levels to it, and there isn't that nuanced understanding at university or at academia. But I think also, like, when you get the assessment, they don't even tell you that much about it. So I don't think academia is particularly accessible from that point of view.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you all for your very insightful presentations. I know that's certainly given me a lot of food for thought as we go into the rest of our discussion. So with those views in mind, we'll move on to the discussion questions, where I'll open up the questions to the panel to discuss among themselves. And I want to begin with our first theme, accessibility. So a huge part of accessibility within academia are, as we've mentioned, the reasonable adjustments that have to be made for learning, whether that's extra time in exams or special considerations during marking. There's definitely a push to integrate disabled students into the structure of standardized grading and assessments. So this often leads to disabled students feeling like their access requirements are add-ons in a world that values a one-size-fits-all approach. So bearing this in mind, my first question to the panel is this, and I'll pop this in the chat. Can a standardized approach to higher education ever be fully accessible? So anyone can do the first response. I'll just pop that in the chat now.
I would very much say no. I think exactly as you've just said, there's this approach of the one size fits all, and it's just not the case. There is so many different disabilities, and even within disabilities, there can be so many different variations of presentations and different individual needs. And I think it's that as we inherently are individual people, and that is what needs to be addressed, not just this kind of blanket, we'll try and make this generally work for everyone. And exactly why, like what Lily said about the cover letter for your assignments, and it's like, well, actually, yeah, okay, that is a struggle, but there's all these other things that we need to consider and we need to try and work around. And if you're just trying to go for one singular thing and not look at the individual presentation and what people are individually dealing with, I don't see how it can be considered accessible for everyone.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with Nia, and believe that the only standardization that we can do is the expectation that we will accommodate people according to their needs, and that is not a lot of information or guidance, but I think, well, here in the United States, we have Office of Disability Services, our Office for Disabled Students on most college campuses. And so as a professor, I get letters each semester from students that need accommodations. And, but I get so many complaints from the students about the accommodations that are available or not to them and the proof that they have to put in. So it's, yeah, it's wonderful that we have this office in charge of it, but I think professors also have to make it fully accessible, each individual professor has to understand the needs.
I would agree with your point, Jason. I think we don't make enough use of is the notion of equivalence. So you can assess a module in different ways that could be equivalent to each other. But what we've developed is a pattern of assessment that is one type of assessment in which we mediate or give exemption, or we put a scaffolding around to accommodate different disability. I think we could do more to actually generate types of assessment which allow people to choose the way in which they want to express their learning, which might be more sympathetic to their abilities. And as long as it was equivalent, then I feel that that will be sufficient, and would then be playing to people's strengths rather than trying to accommodate a deficit. And maybe I'm on a bit of a hobby horse with this, but I think that the issue I have with the debate is that we're talking about deficit, disability, rather than advantage, difference. And I think there's a whole narrative we need to look at as an academic community. So, you know, if you think about how non-neurotypical people have done amazing things in our world, and we could list off the Einsteins and others who have contributed to our whole society's development, they actually would have a disability at university. And yet, if we could embrace that advantage or difference, then I think that might be a really powerful way of changing the way we learn and assess.
Yeah, I would agree with Nigel. I think it would be really amazing if people got to pick what kind of assessments that they received. But what I also find frustrating is that when you hear of students in different schools, and some schools and universities have a lot better systems. So like in my school, it's for every module, it'll be like one exam at the end or one essay at the end, and 100% of that module is going towards that, when some schools will have presentations and projects and midterms and like marks for class participation, or like even their dissertation, only 50 is for the actual dissertation, and then some of it is for a presentation, and then some of it is for like your communication that you've had with the dissertation supervisor. So it's a lot more spread out. But so in my school, so this year I only have 5 pieces of work, which might sound great, but ultimately that all rides on 5 pieces of work that will have very similar deadlines. And because my learning disability will get really affected when I'm tired and stressed out, and when all of that is coming to one January deadline and then one May deadline, my performance would be a lot less than if it had been staggered with different things throughout the year, with like presentations and class participation. I would find that to be a lot more beneficial for me, and I imagine a lot of other disabled students.
Lily, I think you're absolutely right. And what I would do as an educator when I was designing a module is I would have my learning outcomes, which I was trying to achieve. I could assess those learning outcomes in multiple ways. Given the right support, the right training, the right infrastructure, I could have equivalent assessments that would demonstrate somebody had achieved that learning outcome. And for me as an educator, I'm not about trying to get people to prove something. What I'm trying to do is to get them to engage in learning. And so it's a different philosophy, I think.
I want to speak more to what Nigel was speaking about assessment, and Lily touched on this too, and like a deficit model of disability. So at least here in the United States, this poses a problem as a precursor to any type of accessibility in the classroom. So in the United States, if you want any kind of protection under the law against discrimination, the first thing you have to do is claim that you are part of a discriminated against class. Not sure exactly how this works in the UK, but the first step is go to an adjudicator or a court and like admit some kind of problem or deficit. So even if the assessment itself is equitable, the process has started with a expectation and almost like an admitting that you are less than. And so disabled students necessarily go into the process feeling behind already.
I think something that was quite interesting as well, mentioning about, you know, wanting people to engage with learning and that really being the aim, that actually when we talk about if there's a standardized approach to learning, you know, we deliver a module generally, like we've got a standard way that we're receiving that module, and actually there can be a lot of different ways to learn within that. And something that I found throughout my time at university is there's a very heavy reliance on the extra reading. And for me, that is exactly what I struggle with, and something that has caused me immense problems throughout completing my degree. And in all honesty, I only started doing the reading for my course in my 4th and final year this year. So I think that's something where we can look at, actually, there's a lot of other ways we can encourage people to engage with information, or we can guide them towards information that doesn't just have to be reading this hefty textbook, or, you know, shoving this really complex article at them and being like, you need to read this in the next 15 minutes and then present it in your seminar. Because actually things like that, it's not accessible at all. And that's this kind of standardized approach where we just expect everyone to be able to engage in the same way. And actually there's probably a lot more we can do to tailor education to our different needs.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think what we've done is, in universities, we've replicated a model in school, which is about what I would call fine detail thinking. So that favors the neurotypical, and that we do need people who can do fine detail thinking, but we also need people in our population who do creative thinking, who can think in pictures, can think in patterns. And it's not about one being better than the other, they're just different. And as a population, we need to hold in our decision-making institutions people who have got diversity of thinking in order to make better decisions. So I think we've ended up as a society in rewarding fine detail thinking in preference to, let's just call it picture thinking or pattern thinking, and we've ended up with less good decisions. And maybe, I'm not saying it's the pandemic is about this, but I think that when you look at when we're dealing with very complex, difficult situations, to make the best decisions, we need diversity of thinking. So we should be celebrating people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, other types of ADHD, autism, because they bring new insight into complex problems.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. That was bang on time as well. So I'd like to move on to our second theme of the evening, which is the culture of ableism. So I mentioned in my introduction earlier that while people are going into work less, our expectations of productivity have not subsided. So this question and its follow-up are looking to explore how productivity may be interlinked with ableism and how that impacts academia. Obviously, with the increasing privatisation of universities, we've seen more lecturers striking this year and last year, and a lot of that is to do with higher expectations in terms of workload, which some might argue is very ableist. So here's a question for you, and I'll pop this in the chat again. Is the drive to be productive ableist? And if so, how does toxic productivity impact academia?
I think a lot of this goes back to assessment and how we assess what is productive. Like productivity is important to the the outcomes of any learning goal. Part of learning is learning to use that learning to approach the rest of the world and work within a job in the future. And so I think the assessment of what we deem to be productive needs to be rethought, but not the idea that students must be productive at all, just what we consider to be valuable.
Yeah, I agree with that. I find like the way that university is set out, at least in my school, it's so about a means to an end, and it will be about the essay that's at the end of the module. And because people might not have, like, people end up not having time to even learn all of the things in the module. Just what will happen is, like, the second that the questions are released, they'll decide one and only do the reading for that topic, because it's become so much about doing an essay and getting a grade and like getting a first and, you know, being able to put that on your LinkedIn. Like, it doesn't feel like education is about the enjoyment because the education isn't about the enjoyment anymore, because it's about the product that you're going to have at the end of it, if you see what I mean, which I find is quite sad. And then no one ends up remembering what they've learned because they've just crammed it.
I would absolutely agree with Lily. And what I do with a lot of my classes, so there are learning goals and skills goals. The goal isn't, you know, to have a wonderful essay. That's the goal is for somebody to learn that process and go through the process so that they can learn things about like critical thinking. So often in my classes, students that might need accommodations, instead of focusing on making them do the work like everyone else, it's more about the journey of getting there and working with them and the process. So yeah, I consider productive students to be students that engage with the material and at least ask for help on their terms, and don't try to make everybody assessed in the same way.
I think kind of leading on from that as well, again, this is probably quite specific to my experience of university, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily global to other universities, but we get given kind of a set amount of hours that we should be doing work outside of lectures, and it seems to pretty much dominate all week, every week. There's pretty much the impression is that you are working most of the day, every day. And I think especially like generally, I found like having a disability, I kind of have to work that bit harder to kind of stay on par with others as well. And so I think there's this kind of idea that everyone is just expected to be at this really like constant rate of work all the time, and actually there's no considerations for the fact that yes, okay, some of us have maybe got to even go further than that to try and feel like we're staying on an equivalent level, but then also the fact that sometimes the disabilities and conditions we have don't make that possible. And, you know, for example, I have long-term health conditions. Sometimes I won't be able to leave the house because I need to stay at home for various reasons, and I find it quite hard to work from home, but also in general, like the impact of like the health condition and how that plays up would have on my working. And I know that's the same across various health conditions, that just sometimes you aren't able to work because there's other stuff going on, and there's very limited, I would say, accommodations for that type of thing. And if there is any accommodations for it, where it's like, actually, there's been this period of time where I haven't been able to get this done because I've had to deal with my health condition, they'll say, oh, but you already have this kind of, the disability services already in place, you already have, you know, a little bit of something extra. And it's like, yeah, but that was for the things that I find difficult anyway, never mind this then additional thing that's prevented me from being your standard of productive for this period of time. And there's often comes back to this thing of there being these hurdles and these hoops that you've got to jump through to be able to feel like you are what is required in terms of productivity.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I think there are a couple of things I'd like to say. I'm not going to talk about what it's like to be an academic or run an academic department, because there's a whole big discussion about that, which we won't have now. But I do recognize that I think both Jason, Lily, and Nair have also mentioned this, that if you do have a disability, that you need to work harder than your peers. And I would say that has been true throughout my life. I feel I've had to work harder to visibly demonstrate what the norms are people are expecting. So I think I've just learned that that is my reality. But what I would do is recognize that I can bring some extra things because of who I am, and that's important. But I just wanted to ask, in a sense, put a proposition to the group, which was, what is the point of university? So, and of course, the university is about learning. Yes, But I think learning is complex and multifaceted. So I think you are engaged, and I was engaged in formal learning where I did a module, got assessed, thankfully got a mark or passed it, whatever I needed to get to my next whatever. But also a lot of informal learning goes on in a university where you might go and do something, whether it's social media training, whether it's running a society in the union. You're also engaging in informal learning where you're picking up mentors, you're developing relationships, you're networking. So the totality of your experience at university is way bigger than the formal piece. We have to get over the formal piece, but we shouldn't miss the opportunity to get engaged in those non-formal, informal learning opportunities, which might play to our strengths, which may not be so assessment driven, so we can be freer and engage more fully in that. So we might emerge from university holistically, actually quite capable across a wide range of things, even though we've had to work extremely hard just to get the badge at the edge, at the end of it all.
I think that's definitely right, but I think there's just so much of a culture of then like people. So I do a lot of extracurricular stuff and I also work really hard at uni, but I think it's just like become so competitive, and then like when you're looking on LinkedIn and there are other people and they're still getting first and they're doing all of the other stuff, then it can just feel very it feels like people are always trying to like one up each other and doing like, oh, I'm making this society now and I'm doing this volunteering thing, and it's gotten very competitive. And I think that's like lost what uni is about, because I think also a lot of it is about a social experience and like a formative thing, rather than just getting a grade and then also like piling your CV with different extracurricular things.
I think I absolutely agree with what you've said there, Lily. I think there's very much, I wanted to come to uni because I really wanted to learn more about my subject, but also there's definitely an element of I think quite a big element of you come to uni because it's kind of that thing of, you kind of feel like you have to get a degree in this day and age, and then it's become more and more so of like, okay, you've got to fill this box and you've got to check this box and you've got all these other things that you've also got to do to try and make yourself stand out. And I guess that contributes to this kind of idea of society as a whole really having this view of productivity, and this, you've got to be able to do all of this and show all of this and continue to work at this level and do this well to kind of almost inherently be valued, I think, in society. And I think it's a much broader problem as well, generally, but definitely an interesting way to think about it.
Thank you so much, guys. A lot of that I could definitely relate to, so that's really affirming to hear from you all. And I'd like to move on to our final theme for the evening, which is disability justice. So I believe for discussions like these, where we're focusing on the negative side of living with a disability, it's definitely very helpful to have a sense of where we can go from here. As someone who works within student activism, I often think about the topic of disability justice and what that would actually look like in higher education. So with that in mind, my final questions of the discussion, which again, I'll pop into chat before we move into the Q&A, are the following. What are the next steps in combating ableism in academia, and how does student activism fit in with that?
Nia, were you?
You go, it's all right.
Okay. Now, I guess I can kind of speak as somebody who's just finished graduate school and been working with undergrads teaching people that weren't that much younger than me, and now transitioning into faculty. I've seen a big shift in the last few years that I find really encouraging, and maybe to the people who are currently in university may not see the same thing, but there's been a huge shift, at least in the United States, in people's attention to accessibility and disability as a important construct. And so that's been very encouraging. And then also in the US, there are now so many programs for graduate certificates and undergrad minors in disability studies, accessibility studies, assistive technology studies, geared towards education. And there's hundreds of them around the US now, which I find very encouraging. And I think that is I think that's the way forward, is just integrate it into the normalcy of the university. In the next generation or 20 years, I think we'll see a huge shift in what we expect from accessibility in universities.
Yeah, I think the general kind of shift towards the increased awareness of it is definitely, maybe starting to feel like a bit of a win. But I think for me, the thing that where I feel the biggest change is needed actually is in educating some of the academics who haven't had that kind of first-hand experience of disability, to actually just help them understand a bit more what the experience is like of especially trying to complete higher education with a disability, and for so many disabilities. Because I think again, just purely from my experience, that there's this kind of notion of, you say you're disabled and there's kind of an automatic assumption of maybe what you might need and but there's this lack of individual consideration, and it's this kind of need to help people understand that there are so many different pathways within that, and there are so many different ways that people might need help, and just that general increase in understanding. And I think also it'd just be really nice maybe for that to kind of come a bit more from having more people with disabilities in the academic positions who have that kind of first-hand experience. And it just kind of, if you were taught by someone with a disability, I think that it must be like they've got then that perspective, they can understand that. And also as a disabled student, it'd be quite nice to see someone firsthand working in that kind of position and be like, okay, yeah, like this is fine, I can do this sometimes. Because sometimes you do need that kind of almost role model to be like, yeah, okay, people do this, because sometimes it just feels like it's not a thing that happens, and that pathway into academia especially doesn't feel like it's always there. And yeah, I think it would just be nice to see that kind of more shift towards inclusivity in academic staff. And I guess student activism can come into this through I guess that increased awareness, and that that push, the real push for educating the academic staff who do not have that first-hand experience with it.
I think what's an important step in combating ableism is kind of creating like a circular process of students who have got a disability being taught about the disability and people highlighting how it's a good thing. And from that, they won't feel like a nuisance or like an extra cost, or like, so like a big thing, I always feel like I'm thick at uni because of the learning disability. But if you're taught that you're not a nuisance and that you're not thick and that you can actually be positive, that would also lead to more people coming out, to use Nigel's term, about their disability. And in turn, that can go into them being more comfortable going into academia. So then they could become teachers and then continue to teach disabled students that it can be positive. And then I think that creates a circle of disabled people feeling good.
Lily, I think you're absolutely right, and in a way, what I would wish for is that we could flip the debate and move to much more about what we contribute to society, not how society has to accommodate us. We've got the legal frameworks, we can demand support appropriate to our disability, but I would like us to be talking about what we can contribute to society as a collective. So maybe this is about, what students can do, what you can do is form a collective, and how big that collective is completely up for discussion. But I would at least want to see one collective that was looking at neurodiversity and looking at ways in which that could be celebrated, and also ways in which that collective could inform the academic community about things like alternative forms of assessment that show the learning outcomes, but are done in a way that is individualized to individuals' capability as well as disability. So I suppose for me it would be, let's flip the debate. Let's talk about our contribution we can make to society and how absolutely critical it is in our decision making to have diversity. And we need diversity in all its forms, not just neurodiversity. We need, every type of diversity we can accommodate within our decision making process. And I think students are very powerful. You may not feel it as an individual, but as collective you are, because without you, there's no universities. We're just research institutes if we don't have students. And so without you, universities are nothing. So I think you can use that as a collective thing to try and get the debate moved away and towards something a lot more about our positive contribution to society, simply because of who we are.
Absolutely agree with Nigel there that, well, it's about accommodating, and by accommodation, I don't necessarily mean just for disability. Like whether it's disability or something else, there are all kinds of learning differences and different approaches and strengths and skills. So teaching to that and accommodating the differences in people actually, I think, strengthens the learning experience for everybody overall. I know in some of my classes I've had I don't know, students with, ADHD who can't sit through the whole thing. And I just encourage them to actually stand up in class if they need to. Whatever movement or sounds you need to make are fine. And if you establish it at the beginning of the semester, the rest of the class kind of embraces it, and it becomes a point of actually learning. I don't know, it strengthens the learning environment for everybody if they are free to move about freely. So I think behaviors in the classroom and approaches to presenting information benefit everybody when we start to think broadly.
Yeah, that's really lovely. And I like the idea. I'd love to do a module called Envisioning 101, which actually celebrated people's creativity, was rigorous and all the things you'd have to do to have a module, but it was dyslexia friendly or neuro non-typical friendly. So you knew as a student you could take that module, develop skills that you've already got, but that take them to another level, and achieve some recognition for that. And that would, I think, be, even little things like that would demonstrate to the whole community that we could enhance people's skills who had got who were non-neurotypical.
Yeah, I think coming back to the point that I think everyone's kind of made now, it just would be actually really nice to see that level of celebration of differences, as opposed to the kind of negative connotations that I think you automatically have. I think especially when you're younger and you kind of have that initial like, oh, I have this problem facing me, actually just really shifting the narrative and being like, okay, this is something that's different, but this is what's different and actually is really great. And that would be a really nice thing to see encouraged and switched in academia. I mean, it's something that, since you said it in this session, Nigel, it's not something I particularly thought of in that perspective, and actually it's a really interesting one to consider of what strengths you actually have because of that. And yeah, it's just very interesting, definitely.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was a really refreshing discussion. I think it's very easy as a disabled student to become a bit disillusioned with accessibility and how lecturers understand that. So it's really refreshing to hear that there are lecturers who are thinking this way. So thank you so much, all of you, for such insightful contributions. I know that our audience will have plenty to take away from that, whether they're watching this live or watching this on demand. And we finished that section a bit early, so we've got a bit more time to spend on the Q&A, which is great, because we had quite a few people submit questions when they signed up, and I managed to compress them into a few questions where there was overlap. we'll alternate between live questions and submitted questions. So if anyone would like to pop a question into the chat about the discussion we've seen tonight, please do so. They can be aimed at a specific panelist or the entire panel. It's up to you. So I think I'll start with a submitted question while people put their questions into the chat. So my first question is, do you think universities recognise when their practices may be ableist and just ignore it, or just don't recognise the ableism in some of the ways they are set up?
I think possibly there's the kind of inherent thing of, if you haven't experienced something, or you're not, necessarily maybe close to someone who has experienced that, so you're not particularly aware, you possibly can remain a bit oblivious to the way that academia or just society in general is set up to kind of suit your needs and not necessarily accommodate for others. And so obviously I think it is kind of hard to say, not being on the policy making side or anything, but from, I guess, general experience of other scenarios, it seems that sometimes people just really are oblivious because of the lack of first-hand experience, which is a massive shame. But
yeah, I would like to think that it's an oblivious decision rather than a deliberate decision, because I think it is, to echo what Nia said, it's very easy to not realise lack of accessibility if you're not experiencing it. Like, even so, like my job that I do alongside uni is that I'm a care worker, and I've worked in old people's homes and learning disability, like autism homes, and even like homes that are built for wheelchair users won't be wheelchair accessible. And I feel like, because a lot of the time the people that are building or designing the buildings aren't either the wheelchair users or the care workers pushing people around in wheelchairs, and they won't actually notice that the door isn't big enough and things like that. Even in a place that's designed for it, there are still so many mistakes crop up. So I'd like to think a lot of that is accidental, that they've not been in the shoes rather than just deliberately ignoring it.
Yes, part of the difficulty as a student is not necessarily getting accommodations, but convincing people that it's something in need of accommodations. And so I think a lot of universities aren't, I don't think they're necessarily deliberately ignoring things. I think, yeah, the problem comes with recognizing what needs accommodation. And I think universities, for the most part, want to be able to do what's right, but unless you're in the situation or a specific situation, it's hard to know exactly what's needed.
I would agree with the comments here, because I think we need to remember that universities are old institutions with embedded practices, and in order to become a senior leader at a university, you need to serve your time, and that means that people like me are in senior leadership roles, and we will not have the experience or competence to engage in the very debates that we're doing this evening. So I think the student voice becomes so important, because particularly when you do this as a collective through the unions, you can actually influence, because you sit on some of those very senior committees that universities have, and can start to bring about an influence and a change in approach that inherently the institution doesn't know always that it needs to do.
That's an excellent point, Nigel, that everybody in charge of these things have been there a while, and they're doing what they've been taught to do from the people ahead of them. So it's not that they're not wanting to know new things, but they have to have new information presented to them. And I think, yeah, students getting involved and speaking up will go a long way with administrators that actually want to hear the problems.
Yeah, and I think also universities need to encourage their staff to come out as well. So when I gave a talk at Cambridge University, the vice chancellor was in the audience and commented about how few staff had disclosed any form of disability. So, you know, whatever percentage of the population have got a disability, the number of staff disclosing was at a very low level. Now that says to me, they don't feel safe to disclose their disability. And people were really surprised that 3 years ago, I publicly declared I was the dyslexic professor. And I get emails from students, from staff all over the UK and internationally at critical points. So somebody emailed me a few weeks ago about they've been told they couldn't do a PhD because they'd got dyslexia. And she had said, I've now decided, having read your blog, I can do a PhD. I've got a place and I'm starting my PhD. And I thought, fantastic. So I think it's about also universities encouraging their staff to disclose in order that can show student body that there are different routes to achieving success. You don't have to be learned and literate in everything you do to be successful at a university.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm afraid my Wi-Fi cut out. It's just a classic student Wi-Fi. So if you put questions in the chat, I may have missed it. So the next question that I can see in the chat is goes as follows. So to the whole panel, I'm involved in Minds Mentally Healthy Universities programme at the University of Bath. I'm also autistic and have lived experience of mental ill health. I spent 8 years trying to complete a master's, unsuccessfully in the end. Lily talked about a circle of disabled people feeling good when disabled students become academics. I love that. Can you talk a bit more about the impact of ableism in academia on mental health? And can you talk about the positive impact on mental health of academic environments which embrace and celebrate the invaluable contributions of disabled students, academics and staff?
I want to say thank you for that comment, Arabella. And then, so I think the impact on mental health, I think from the learning disability point of view, like, because you're in an environment where everything is about intelligence and you have any kind of divergent to the normal intelligence, the primary impact is that I just feel stupid all the time, which of course doesn't make me feel good. And I know that I'm not, because I got here fair and square as all of my peers did. But that is just like an overwhelming feeling that happens all the time. But I think to move on to the next question about the positive impact, like even I feel so much better about my disability now than at the beginning of the panel. And I think especially so this year, I'm a liberation coordinator at my university. So I've been working alongside Anna in doing some of the events for Disability History Month. And again, like, I feel so much better than I did about it before. And like, even when I was applying to the liberation coordinator thing, I wasn't even sure whether to apply as a disabled one because I felt so much shame around it and was just going to do it as being woman and LGBT. But it took a lot of courage to put myself as disabled. And it's just been a really positive experience in running these events and having access to other disabled people, because there aren't a lot at uni because of various accessibility reasons, and to be in spaces like this and have positive conversations is very impactful. I think that's, yeah, my answer. Thanks.
Lily, that's great. Can I follow on from Lily just to say thank you, but also we're talking a lot about the R number, aren't we? So the R number, we've got to get the R number below 1 to stop the pandemic from spreading. What we need to do in this community is get the R number really high. We need to be infecting people with enthusiasm about what we as individuals can bring to different communities. So the only way we do that is by sharing and talking to other people. So I think what you're doing, I know we talked a bit before the call started about the liberation movement within unions, is absolutely critical, because we do need to spread this word that people with a disability have got significant contributions to make to society, and demonstrate how we go about that. So I think events like this, communicating and sharing and supporting each other, are critical to getting people to realize the value we bring to any community or institution.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So we'll move on to another one of our submitted questions. I thought this would be quite an interesting change up. So what advice about the future would you give your 11-year-old self?
I think one of the biggest things that I would think now is you don't need to get bogged down on a diagnosis. It's not definitive, and that is one of the biggest challenges that I have faced being at uni, and one that really I've only very recently, I think, started to actually overcome. I think for the longest time I've kind of felt like I was battling against this label that you get given. It's like, you have this thing wrong with you, but it's like, that's just a part, and there's this whole other person that's so capable of so many other interesting things, and that's so much more valuable. And I think it's just, yeah, it's so important to try and say, okay, I'm not going to ignore that there's this part of me, because that's equally, I don't think, the correct approach, but it's going, okay, I can accept that, and I can work with it, and I can work around it and embrace it to almost like to a higher level, and not feeling like you have to kind of justify doing things differently or working slightly differently to like neurotypical peers. I think is one of the biggest things, because you are different, but you can do what works for you, and that's really, really okay.
Can I go?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I think what the advice I'd give to my 11-year-old self is that academic intelligence is by no means the most important one, and that emotional intelligence is, I think, significantly more important. And I think any kind of divergent that someone has from the norm is so beneficial in that you can relate to the people who also have experienced that. So I can relate to people with learning disabilities and people with anxiety, like, because it's very hard to understand what those things mean reading from a textbook, but when you have them, you are open up to that community and can have so much like empathy within that. And I think that is more beneficial from academia. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent now, but empathy.
I was not disabled at 11. I acquired my disability later in life. So, but the advice that I would give still pertains to, I think, any disabled student or any student. But it can be more useful for a student who is disabled because of isolation. And part of what Lily said, like, there's emotional intelligence as well. So schooling isn't just about your books and your papers and doing math problems. Be sure to learn to get along with people, make a wide array of friends, and stay in touch with people. Stay in touch with your professors. They're there for you. I was really bad at that, and I ended up really isolated, especially after I acquired my disability. I didn't know how to reach out to people. And I didn't make connections with professors so that, you know, for recommendations or, you know, whatever it is. But it's really important for your own mental health and stability, and also for your own like benefits in other ways, to like network with people and stay in touch and be friendly with people.
Yeah, that's really good. I think I would probably go to my 8-year-old who was about to go to boarding school and really experience what words were all about. And I would say it's going to be tough. Let's not mess about. It's going to be tough. But actually, you've been born with a great advantage, and nurture it and yourself, and it will become a superpower. And it will help all of those around you. So I would try to encourage them to recognize that once they emerge from this system of formal education, and perhaps university is part of that, your contribution to society will be immense if you can continue to believe in yourself. And I say that partly because one of the things I'm doing now is meeting people with dyslexia, autism, very senior people, very successful, who are now coming together and talking about it openly. And even in a small way, we're trying to influence some of the big decisions that are in our world by saying, actually, to come up with the best solutions, you need to engage with a diverse community of thinkers. So I think we've a lot to offer as non-neurotypicals. And I would just want my younger self to know that at the end, there is light at the end of the tunnel, I think.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was very positive feedback. So our next question, so first of all, there's comments saying, thank you for an illuminating, challenging and inspiring discussion. You'll rock. And the question that follows is, following the theme of celebrating diversity and challenging the deficit model, what strengths do you recognise and celebrate in your own experience of disability?
I'll have a little go, because I want to pick up something that Lily said about empathy. Empathy is just so important in our society, to be able to understand something from someone else's perspective, to put yourself in their shoes. I think that makes us a more tolerant society. And I would say that actually having any form of disability, like Lily said, I think it increases our empathy ability. I don't know if that's a proper word, but that makes us much better citizens. And if we can get to positions of influence, we can change things. So I think that if I could pick one thing, it would be empathy power, if there's such a thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think as well, generally, just getting through every day, sometimes with a disability, sometimes it can be a challenge. And I think there's a lot to be said for just recognizing your own strength in some of the things that you have had to overcome and deal with. And I think inherently it makes you stronger as a person because of the things that you face and you overcome. And I think that's really good to recognize in yourself, and kind of almost sometimes you have to take a step back and give yourself a pat on the back and go, do you know what, I did this, and that's pretty cool. And I think that's really important.
I think there's a big concern, among the disabled community around the idea of inspiration porn, right? The idea that disabled people are there to inspire able-bodied people to do better in their own lives. But we have to be sure that we don't use that against ourselves. And we realize we have to acknowledge the things that might be more challenging for us, and celebrate ourselves for managing and still living our lives. We don't want to bring it to the point of like inspiration porn, but we have to recognize that we are dealing with challenges and dealing well. Also, one other thing that I think I guess a benefit of my own disability, and I wish more disabled academics would realize this, or especially white male academics. I'm in a position of power as a professor and also as a white male, but also because of my quadriplegia, I feel like I can speak to those in power and those who may be marginalized. And I think we need to get more white men on board with identities that can speak to like both sides, so that so we're not throwing away all the knowledge that we're trying to pass down because we're trying to like dismiss a certain populace. But yeah, I think it's important to, in our diversity, keep disability in mind, because it bridges gaps that other identities don't.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. So we're going to move on to a submitted question. And this question is perhaps more for Nigel and Jason. So any advice for postgraduate study with a disability, and any advice for considering next steps in life with a disability?
I'm sorry, could you read that one more time?
Yeah, no worries. So any advice for postgraduate study with a disability, or any advice for considering next steps in life with a disability? And I'll pop it in the chat.
Wow, that's a tricky question. As far as postgraduate study goes, I don't think your disability should prevent you from considering postgraduate study, master's or PhD level. I think it's really important to know what your strengths are and know what the accommodations that you need. So the more that you can do to understand by talking to other people with a similar, let's call it ability now rather than disability, then I think that would encourage you to get those accommodations in place, and then look for a program that really engages you. And as Lily and Naya have also mentioned about this idea of the types of assessment that that particular program does. So again, really investigate, what the modules are, what the assessment regime is. I think student unions got a massive role to play. So I'd be talking to the student union at the university I was thinking of going to, about how active they are and so on. I think in terms of beyond university, I think it's only just now that I've realized, as I've met more people who are not neurotypical, how powerful a contribution we can make. So all I would say is don't wait as long as me to find that out. You know it now on this call. You bring a unique perspective and things like creativity, pattern, all types of different ways of thinking you bring to a situation. And maybe you can find workplaces that will be a huge advantage in. So don't wait till you're my age to discover that.
Thanks for that, Nigel. And I would add on to that, if you are interested in graduate study, master's or PhD, now I don't know exactly how it works in the UK, but at least here in the US, there's no reason you should ever pay for that. There are scholarships and grants that you can apply for. Also, a lot of grad programs pay students to teach or TA or work as graders. So find a program that will pay you. Don't go to one that you have to pay for yourself. I guess it's probably a little bit different in the UK, but oh, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, then also when you are doing it, like look for whatever grants there are. There are lots of research opportunities. And these, if you're interested in postgraduate study, applying for grants looks good on your CV, your resume. So be sure to do that. Take advantage of, and this is whether you have a disability or not, take advantage of all the opportunities and don't pass them up.
Brilliant, thank you so much. So next we've got a question from Aisha, and this is directed at Nigel. How did you work up the courage to come out as disabled? I think it's really important to do, but it's really off-putting when you look at disability and work discrimination statistics. People often advise you not to be open about it too.
Wow. So I think there's a lot of truth in your question that it is a difficult thing to do. I think I was very fortunate in that I felt that I'd reached a point in my career where I wasn't going to be fired for telling the truth. I thought I'm secure enough, and I'm still in the job, which is great news for me. But I think I just got fed up with living under the shadow of not telling people what was increasingly I felt was about the positive side of me. So I think I just got to the point where I felt secure enough in my workplace, and also I felt so fed up with hiding something that was so central to who I was as a person. And I could see that I could do things other people couldn't do because of my dyslexia. So I thought, right, I think this is the moment. And when I did my first blog, I had no idea if anyone would read it. And all I did is I set myself the challenge of doing one blog a week for 52 weeks. So I could then write a blog at the end, which was the year in the life of the dyslexic professor. So that was my goal. And I suppose I didn't overthink it. I think I probably just did it. And then things snowballed. I was picked up by the Times Higher Ed, and they did a big feature on disability. And so then it just grew and grew. So for me, it's been a really positive experience, but I don't want to diminish the strength of feeling in the question that actually it also is a risk. And so you do need to take that careful decision about, is this the right time for you? And do you have enough support around you to come out as whatever it is you need to come out as?
Thank you so much, Nigel. We've got time for one more question, and this is a submitted one. And this is probably mainly aimed towards Nia. Do you have any tips for time management with fluctuating energy / health?
So at the moment, I've been working quite closely with my kind of support mentors that I'm given through the DSA. So the one thing I would say is, if you are given those, use them. I have had them since first year, but again, for some reason, didn't engage until this year. And I would absolutely say that it has been so helpful to just kind of have that person to talk to, and sometimes even just to get the thoughts out of your head and say them out loud and have someone to talk to. You can actually it helps you organize yourself almost, but gives that kind of extra person there to kind of bounce off, or sometimes just to go, if you're feeling like maybe you haven't done as much as you hoped, who can actually sit there and go, but actually no, you've done this and you've done this. And sometimes where, if you like, I know sometimes my medical condition gets in the way from me engaging with work quite a lot, and I will tend to beat myself up and be like, oh, this is annoying, I shouldn't be doing this, I should be able to focus and I should be able to get on with this. And so if you have that there, that's a really great thing to engage with. But if not, one of the things that I found really helpful is just really, really breaking tasks down into the smallest chunks possible, and being realistic, but to the point where you're possibly even giving yourself too much time to do stuff, so that you really know you're going to get something done within a set period of time. And yeah, just one of the biggest things that I would say is, if learn to recognize, if possible, when you aren't able to engage, because that happens. And if you continue to beat yourself up, if you continue to get really bogged down in this feeling of, oh, I should be doing more, or oh, this is frustrating because I've got this that has to happen then, but I can't do this right now, it can spiral a lot more if you become consumed by that feeling. And it can be quite hard not to become consumed by that. But I think that's why it's just important to be aware of when you're having that type of day, and when you need to accept that you've got to take a break from work, and you've got to just look after yourself a little bit and be okay to then maybe get on with it the next day or in a couple of days' times. And then sitting down, not trying to continue with your original plan, but completely reassessing and going, okay, what time frame am I on now? What's feasible? What can I get done? And just, yeah, break things down and just be kind to yourself with your organization, and try as much as you can. Again, something that I myself struggle with quite a lot, but to just be a bit lenient and accept sometimes things can't get done the way that we plan. And it's just, yeah, give yourself the time where you need.
Yeah, I'd quite like to echo what Nia's just said. I feel like life is tough. Like, you don't need to make it tougher for yourself. If I don't feel like doing work that day, I won't do it. And when I'm feeling productive, then I'll really go for it. But like, I feel like if you're feeling not great, you're probably not going to produce the best work. So you might as well just let yourself actually have the rest, and maybe you'll be better the next day.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think sometimes I find if, I'm having a flare-up of a medical condition and it's kind of interrupting my day too much that I can't engage with work. Actually, if I continue trying to engage with work, I feel way worse about how much I get done. Whereas if I just kind of stop and go, that's not happening today, let's just take the day off, I'll find it so much easier then in the coming days to kind of get back on top of it, because I've kind of almost had a bit of a reset with it. Whereas if you keep pushing where it's not happening, it can feel a lot harder, and it can feel a lot easier to kind of end up like having like the snowball effect of being like, oh, this has gone bad, and then the next day goes bad, etc., etc.
I think that's a really good point, and I would just echo that this is a really important life skill to know when you can complete certain tasks at the best time for you. So it might be that if this is a lot of processing, a lot of words, then that might be something you always do in the morning because that's when you're freshest. But of course, beyond university, the skill of working with people is just as important as the technical skill you might bring to a situation. And it could be that you can then do those tasks more ably than other people because of your enhanced empathy or other skills that you've developed because of your ability. So in fact, beyond university, you can actually move between equally important tasks, but make sure they're done at a particular time that suits you. And that would be an important accommodation to negotiate with whoever worked with in the future.
Thank you so much. I think many people find that really helpful, whether they're disabled or not. I think everyone's trying to adjust to a new kind of learning. And I think people are struggling with time management more than ever, having to do everything by themselves from their bedroom. So thanks so much for that. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for today. So I'd first like to thank our audience for coming to this give and take and submitting your questions to our panel. We will be publishing a recorded version of the event, so do share this around afterwards if you feel like it could be valuable to your friends and family. And of course, a huge thank you to all of our fantastic panelists for taking part in the discussion tonight. I know I'm feeling very inspired and hopeful by this discussion as a disabled student who might want to progress in academia. And it's brilliant. So yeah, so before we wrap up in the evening, so for those of you who signed up, the feedback form will be emailed to you. So if you could just take a minute to fill that out afterwards, that would be brilliant. We're doing some more events for SU's Disability History Month. I'll pop the website on the chat in a second, and that will have details of other projects that are happening this month virtually by unions across the country. That also includes a podcast that Lily and I are doing called Defined by Disability. So listen out for that. And thank you again, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your weeks.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone else.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone.